Good afternoon, New York, and the rest of our listeners around the globe. My name is June Stoyer, and I'm the host of the Organic View Radio Show. Our podcast is available on iTunes, Zune, and you can also visit our website at www.theorganicview.com. If you'd like to be on the show or would like to find out about sponsorship opportunities, please contact us at questions@theorganicview.com. Today's show is sponsored by coronatools.com, the nation's leader in garden and landscaping tools. Listeners of The Organic View can receive 20% off their coronatools.com purchase by using the coupon code ORGVIEW. That's ORGVIEW. For more promotional offers, please visit our website at www.theorganicview.com. And don't forget to check out our contest section.
Are GMO pesticides supertoxins? Most educated consumers are opting to buy non-GMO products because of concerns about how GMOs impact their health. On today's show, Dr. Jonathan Latham will be my guest to talk about a new analysis which focuses on the toxicological consequences of GMBT toxins in food and in the environment. So I'd like to welcome to the show Dr. Jonathan Latham. Good afternoon and welcome back to the show.
Hi, June.
Dr. Latham, before we begin, can you share with our listeners a little bit about your work?
Sure. So I am the executive director of a nonprofit called the Bioscience Resource Project, and we are, among other things, the publishers of a website called Independent Science News. And part of our work, which I think we're going to talk about today, is writing papers for the scientific literature to fill in information gaps. And often places where scientists don't want to go because, there are career penalties, for example, for discussing certain kinds of issues. And so that's why we wanted to talk about BT toxins.
Thank you. I'd like to ask you a couple of basic questions just so that some of the folks that are out there that are either new to this subject or don't quite understand some of these terms can have a better understanding of what they are. Could you explain what a GMO is?
Sure. So, and normal plant breeding involves the sexual reproduction between species. So pollen and ovules get together and you can create new varieties that way. And this is just a speeded up version of what nature does already. So genetic engineering is taking lengths of DNA from various organisms, stitching them together to make a genetic unit, if you like, a sort of artificial gene that you hope will function in a new organism that you put it in. And basically you can take DNA from pretty much any organism and put it into pretty much any crop. And basically the way that you do that, once you stitch together your piece of DNA, you put it onto a particle or you put it into a bacterium. There's basically two ways of making genetically engineered plants. So one is to put this DNA onto a particle, and you shoot the particle into a piece of plant tissue that has been kept on a petri dish for a couple of weeks. So once it's been on there for a couple of weeks, it's probably usually a leaf tissue, that it becomes receptive to regeneration, and what it can do is take up the DNA that you shoot in on the particle, and the particle is basically damaged DNA on its way through the leaf tissue. It's basically damaged the DNA, and the DNA of the plant, the host plant, has to repair itself. And so it takes any DNA that it can find, and you've just supplied some on a particle, and so it will take that DNA and it will repair the injury to the chromosome. And then those leaf tissues, you can transfer them onto a special medium of hormones, which causes the plant, those leaf cells, to start to become new plants. So they start to produce sort of a flower bud or a bud, and then they start to produce roots, and the tissue grows from being a piece of leaf into a whole plant. And that whole plant will have the DNA in it that you put in, that came in on the particle, or that was transferred into there from the bacterium. And so you can then breed from that plant by the normal breeding process. And that is how how companies do it these days for the most part.
Can you explain what Bt toxins are and how they work?
Yeah, so Bt toxins are taken from a bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis. So Bacillus thuringiensis is a bacterial species that is a gut pathogen of insects and many other organisms. So, and that bacterium produces toxins that make holes in the gut lining of organisms that it lives in. So basically it hangs around in the soil as a spore, and then it gets taken up by an insect or a slug or a nematode or some organism crawling around, and the spore germinates and releases a toxin. And this toxin is basically makes holes in your in gut membranes. So what that allows is for the bacterium to basically invade the body tissues of the organism that's eaten it, and then it can reproduce. It basically kills the organism and lives on the dying and decayed tissues. So the protein itself, so the toxin itself, is actually a protein. So it's quite unusual. So most toxins in the world, and synthetic pesticides, for example, they are all small molecules, small soluble molecules, like things like chlorpyrifos or DDT. These are small synthetic chemicals that can be made in a vat. But Bt toxins are proteins that cannot be made except by living organisms. And so, but what that means is that they're very useful for making genetically engineered crops, because as you probably know, DNA makes RNA makes protein. That means if you can find the piece of DNA that encodes those proteins, you can cause the genetically engineered plant. So you've basically changed it in the way that I was suggesting earlier. You can basically insert that DNA, and the plant will start to produce the proteinaceous toxin. And this protein toxin, when it's expressed in the leaves and the corn tissues or the roots or whatever plant tissue it's in, it will kill insect pests or other pests that eat that tissue.
Thank you. In regards to some of the health issues that many people are experiencing pertaining to gut health, do you think that it's possible that consumption of any type of product that contains genetically modified ingredients is contributing to issues in the human gut, which is making that particular food indigestible or creating other issues such as fatigue or other health-related issues?
I do think it's possible. I don't think our research proves it, but what our analysis essentially does is make it more possible, or makes it more possible to understand what would be a theoretical mechanism by which these toxins could affect the human gut or membranes that exist in the human body. So what our research has shown is that if you take these GMO toxins and you express them in transgenic plants, so in a crop plant like a corn or a soybean, what those proteins are different from the naturally occurring toxins that exist in nature, that the Bacillus thuringiensis bacterium makes itself. So the big story that the biotech industry likes to share about these pesticides is that everybody knows that these are, or many people know, informed people know that GMO crops, many of them are producing a pesticide, and that pesticide is the Bt toxin, the protein that I was just talking about. But what the industry says is that these proteins are natural, and the natural toxicological limitations of those proteins mean that those proteins cannot cause any harm to people. Now, that may be true for the naturally occurring proteins, although there's some evidence that it's not true. But we can go into that separately. But even if it was true for the naturally occurring molecules, we can still ask the question, is it also true for the proteins that the companies like Monsanto and Syngenta and Dow have put into these the GMO crops, right? And so we decided to look at the differences between naturally occurring and GMO toxins, and we found there were a lot of differences. And what those differences appear to do, and in some cases there's excellent evidence that they do actually do this, is those differences have allowed protein toxins, which have a very narrow host range, to actually become protein toxins with a broad host range. So basically the whole safety premise of these toxins is putting them into, basically if you put GMO toxins into a crop, then you're basically eating a pesticide, right? So if you're eating a pesticide, the EPA wants to know, or they certainly ought to know, whether that pesticide is safe for people to eat or not. Because ordinarily, the presumption about pesticides is that they're not safe. You shouldn't actually be eating any of them. Some of them are not safe at any dose. And so what the companies have been arguing this whole time is that the proteins they put into these plants are just the same as the natural ones, and the natural ones have a limited host range. And what our research shows is that what in many cases the companies have done is they've taken off the parts of those proteins that actually limit their host range. So essentially it's like having a sheath on a sword. So you have a toxin, for example, that is in a sense as dangerous as a sword, right? It basically will kill any cell that it comes in contact with, or will damage any membrane that it comes into contact with. So that is if you remember, that is the mode of action of these toxins, is to make holes in membranes, right? If you make a hole in the membrane of any cell, that cell becomes compromised and may well die as a consequence of that. And if you make 4 or 40 holes in them, it will definitely die. And so that is how these toxins work. And so in order for them not to make holes in the wrong place, for example, imagine the bacterium, it produces these toxins, but it doesn't want to have holes made in its own membranes. So that is why the bacterium stores the toxin as a crystal, right? They're called also, their other name is cryproteins, and they're crystals. They're very unusual protein crystals. But the versions expressed in the GMO plants are not crystals, right? So the toxicological difference here is that you have a molecule that makes holes in proteins. And if you eat a naturally occurring crystal, you cannot dissolve that because your stomach does not have the right pH and so forth. It doesn't have the right conditions to dissolve that toxin. If you eat GMO BT toxin, you can actually process that toxin. And when you process that toxin, it becomes the toxicologically active version of the protein. So basically it's stored as an inactive form and it has to be processed. And what the companies have done by putting them into GMOs is allow them to be processed. So what that means for your question about the toxicological consequences of these proteins is that we have allowed the companies to put into GMO crops proteins that have the potential to make holes in your gut. And so holes in the gut are a bad idea in general terms. The gut maintains a very tight control over the kind of molecules that enter into it because you don't want, for example, entire bacteria getting into your bloodstream. You don't want proteins that are antigens and so forth, that are small pieces of gluten and so forth. You don't want those to enter your gut. What you want to enter your bloodstream, rather. What you want to enter into your bloodstream is molecules and pieces of DNA, for example, that are fully processed, so they can't harm you, right? So the more processing your gut does before molecules enter the bloodstream, the less harm you're likely to come to from those molecules. And so if Bt proteins put holes in your gut, then they will compromise it. And if you have a compromised gut, then you can suffer from allergies, then molecules that shouldn't get into your gut will get into the bloodstream and so forth. And so there is a potential that creates, what our research does is create an understanding of how what supposedly is a safe pesticide is actually an unsafe pesticide because it's been put into a GMO.
In regards to the proteins that are crystals that cannot be processed by the body, how does the body flush that out?
Well, basically, there are certain molecules that can just pass right through you. Like undigested corn seeds or something like that. They would just pass right through you. So they would never enter the gut. They would never be taken up by the cells that line the gut, for example.
Okay, so the body would just excrete it.
Yep.
It wouldn't have any impact on the kidneys.
Yep. It would just pass right through you. It would be like eating a piece of sand. Yeah.
Thank you. The term supertoxins is something that almost seems to be a prized phrase used by industry. Could you explain what they are and why this is something that really needs to be more widely addressed, especially by the regulatory system?
Well, I would say supertoxins are no one thing, right? It's a descriptive term that we use it because Monsanto used it in a patent in which Monsanto has been attempting to make new and interesting versions of these Bt toxins, but they want to pass them off with regulators as being novel, as being essentially the same as the wild versions, the natural versions of these proteins. But when it comes to making a patent, you can't say to the patent office, there's nothing new and interesting about these toxins. You have to say there's something interesting about the way they kill pests or their concentration needed to kill pests and so forth. And so what the companies have done in the real world is they've taken these proteins, the Bt toxins, and they've changed the DNA that encodes them to make versions that are more powerful in different ways than the naturally occurring toxins. And so they're very honest about this in patents, right? Because that's what a patent office needs to hear in order to grant a patent. But this is the kind of thing that you can't say in a biosafety risk assessment, because it would make it sound as if firstly, you don't know what you're doing, but secondly, that these proteins have an expanded toxicological host range, and that toxicological host range might include mammals, it might include livestock, it might include people even. And so this is an admission that the companies don't want to make in their biosafety applications to, for example, the European Food Safety Authority or to the Australia, New Zealand food safety people. And so basically Monsanto called some of its new Bt toxins, supertoxins, to the U.S. Patent Office, but they didn't use any such term when they applied to EPA for their use as a pesticide, for example.
Thank you. What can we do as citizens to confront the criminality of this situation?
Well, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't know specifically what is the criminal activity that you would accuse companies of. I suspect negligence would be a reasonable word to use, criminal negligence. So, I would argue that the companies know that they're producing toxins that are quite likely much more toxic than they are letting on in public in their biosafety applications. And so what they have to, I would guess that is criminally negligent behavior, but I don't actually know that from a lawyerly perspective. But I would say that it is extremely negligent from a scientific perspective. There's no need for these toxins, and the only reason for them really is to make profits. We can grow crops that don't, we have basically other ways to deal with pests, the other ways to grow healthy and productive crops. We have other agricultural systems that can deal with these problems. And so, I would say that in general, the allowing of pesticides onto the market is an incredibly negligent thing also on the part of EPA, for example. Government regulators deserve at least as much blame as the companies do. If you imagine it's legitimate for a company to make the best product that it can, then we do have a system in which the EPA or other regulators are entrusted with the opportunities and the legal powers to prevent those products coming to the market if they think those products are not safe. But those agencies do not use the powers that they have actually to confront the companies and make sure that products that are harmful or possibly harmful come to the market.
Thank you. Just to recap, if any of our listeners wish to educate family, friends, what have you, what are some of the main points that they should remember when it comes to GMOs?
Well, in the case of BT GMOs, these proteins are not natural, right? So the big story that the companies like to share is that the proteins that they put into, the pesticides they put into GMO crops are natural. And what we show in this paper is that there's no reasonable way to argue that these are natural proteins. They are so wildly different from the naturally occurring versions that calling them natural is completely unreasonable. And so, that is in a sense is a safety claim. Right? That's a safety claim that the companies are making, that essentially they don't need much regulation. So, but in terms of GMOs in general, the safety issues of GMOs are in general that they contain a lot of synthetic pesticides, that they encourage the use of synthetic pesticides, and that they also have health and safety issues all of their own. And I would say that this BT issue is a potentially very, very major public health concern.
Dr. Latham, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show. Could you just take a moment and share your website with our listeners so that if they care to donate to support your research, they could do so?
Yes, you're welcome, June. So, yes, we have a website called www.independentsciencenews.org. So that's INDEPENDENT science, SCIENCENEWS.org. So you can find that website quite easily online by searching those letters. But yes, we would love donations. The most of the dominant model of the media in this country and many other places is basically that they collect advertising in order not to share stories about companies that the companies would rather not share, right? So it's kind of a shakedown. And that business model does not work for us because we're prepared to tell whatever we hear about whoever we hear it about. And so essentially there's no point in anybody advertising on our website. And so we don't take adverts and we don't take money from corporations. And essentially, we're an independent website that operates on a shoestring budget. But I hope, I like to think that we bring some of the most interesting and amazing stories that are on the whole internet And so we would really welcome reader support. It really makes a huge difference. Firstly, for us to morally know that people actually support what we do, but secondly, that there are expenses with hosting a website. And even though our budget is just a few $1,000s a year, we could even do better with more money. And so we would really appreciate that. And in the past, readers have cited your name, June, when they've given us donations, and we really appreciate that.
Well, it means a lot to me, especially since the Organic View has been around for over 10 years now, and we have a global audience of over 3 million listeners. And quite like you, we're very particular about any support that we do receive, and our job is to truly educate the public. So thank you so much for all of the work that you're doing. I know that it's a lot of work. It's very tough work to do, but it's so incredibly important to our own existence. So thank you once again, and I sincerely hope that you do come back when you have more research to share with the listeners.
Oh, we soon will. Thanks very much, June.
You're very welcome. And folks, please check out the companion article which will appear on theorganicview.com, which will also provide the link to Dr. Latham's website and also a place where you can make a donation. Thank you for tuning in. This has been June Stoyer with the Organic View Radio Show. Have a great afternoon.